Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're waiting on the birth of the first child of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in London. With us to talk about the significance of it all and whether or not we're paying a little too much attention to it is Florence FAUCHER. She is with the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po from London. Judith ROWBOTHAM, she teaches history at Nottingham, Trent University. Andrew Child, spokesperson for the anti-monarchy advocacy group Republic. And France 24 Europe editor Christophe ROBEET is also with us. We were talking before the break on just how much coverage this is all getting, not just inside of the UK. Well, here to tell us a little bit more right now for our Media Buzz segment is our own James Creedon. James, on the way. We're expecting him. Hello, James. Okay. Well, we'll go to James in a moment. One of the issues we were talking about just before the break was the one about the whether or not the symbolic importance of it all and how much of a role that the current monarch has. It's a bit of a strange situation, Florence, we have right now. What with right now you've got this reigning monarch who's been there for a long time, and there's speculation over just where things are going to go since Prince Charles has been waiting in the wings for so long.
Well, logically, Prince Charles should become the next monarch. Now, there have been speculations that, in fact, she might decide to kind of jump one generation because Prince Charles is quite unpopular. She will decide, I think, probably in discussions with her government. But of course, the child that is yet to be born, whether it's a boy or a girl for the first time, will be the next in line. And that's actually very important because it shows how the monarchy has become more modern following the scandals of, the death of Diana and the rest. So it's really a sign that it's actually ahead of the rest of the aristocracy, for instance, but is really in keeping with how British society has changed.
All right, here with us now, James Creedon. How are you, sir?
Very well, François.
A lot on your plate today.
Well, yes. Lots on the royal baby. Endless amounts of coverage. Some of it very serious, very straight down the line. Some of it not so serious. Let's take a look at the Daily Mail, because this is the typical coverage you're getting. I guess the baby's on its way, very straight down the line. Photos also of this sort of crazy media presence outside the clinic, etc. But The Guardian, as has got a lot of attention today, is giving internet users and customers a Republican option, right? So there you can click between a royalist option and a Republican option. If you click on the Republican option, there isn't one single headline or detail about the royal baby. I suppose The Guardian does this quite a lot. It likes to vaunt its more Republican reputation. So there you go. Meanwhile, the Daily Mash, which is a satirical paper, they're taking it that one step further again with words that probably shouldn't be read out on air, François, but you get the picture.
It's a family show. Watch it, James.
Right. Now, meanwhile, on Twitter, a lot of people have made the extremely obvious Labour joke. Labour as in the political party and Labour as in childbirth. I see where you're going. Ha ha. So the Huffington Post has basically we have a list there of all the bad Labour jokes, or good if it was original, but except it wasn't original. Lots of people too talking about how perhaps they could be a royal commentator too, having had the experience of being born oneself. That's as one Andrew Muller, British journalist, said. What else do we have?
And you do get the sense that journalists are an easy target in this time because there's a lot of air to be filled, right, yes, during those moments.
Actually, you know what? I have a cartoon that makes almost exactly that point, François. Take a look at this. So people are blaming the journalists, but actually, what do people kind of want to hear about? What do people want to read? This is a French cartoon. The newspaper on the left is talking about Greece. Then you've got Egypt. Then you've got Syria, and everybody crowded behind the paper that is headlining on Kate. So, is chicken and the egg what is getting us talking about it. What about the royal baby maker, François? Have you seen this? This is by
I don't know if I like
thepoke.co.uk. So you can check Kate's eyes with Charles's nose, and what about Kate's mouth or Charles's mouth? There you go. Pretty hideous, and I'm sure the real thing will be
especially
much nicer. Then you've got people poking fun at maybe the commercial aspect of it, because the big, often the argument for the British monarchy and its merits nowadays is economic. So what about this? Royal baby to be named Qatar Airways after landmark sponsorship deal. That's another satirical paper. What about the Queen in typical grandma mode, even though she's actually going to be a great-grandmother?
That's right.
One French, I think, magazine journalist saying perhaps they should find another babysitter because maybe she's not going to adopt that traditional role. What about the front page of the Daily Telegraph, Francois, not 10 years ago, when Prince William was born? Do you know that there were actually 10 other stories on the front page? If you click on that, it's because newspaper formats were very different at the time.
They were all broadsheets at the time.
Exactly. So you got a much, I suppose, people saying, oh, the coverage nowadays, etc. Well, there was a lot of coverage then too, except on the front pages you were also reading about Argentina, if you can see it there, up on the top right, and other such stories. Let me see if we can finish. There was one other thing I wanted to show, but I don't know if we have it. It was Elizabeth Windsor's fake Twitter account simply saying, push, but I don't think we have it. You'll just have to imagine.
Oh dear. Oh well. James Creedon, that's the.
Oh, there it is.
Look, there you go.
That's some great grandmotherly advice.
All right. Well, thanks for that, James Creedon. James Creedon with our Media Buzz segment. Judith ROWBOTHAM. It was interesting seeing that front cover of the Daily Telegraph. Do you get the sense as well sometimes, though, that it does go a little too far today, and that is it really dominating the news cycle that much?
It does appear to be at the moment, and I do think that shows that, apart from anything else, we now get our news in different ways. Once upon a time, we relied so heavily on the newspapers. Then, even by the time that Prince William was born, newspapers were important, but more and more of us got most of our breaking news from sort of radio, television, things like that. Nowadays, newspapers, people read more for stories, to consider what's going on at greater length. And they look to Twitter as the internet and things like that. So I think that newspapers have had to adapt in a number of ways, and it has privileged stories of this kind that people seem to want to read at length, to talk over the breakfast table or the tea table or whatever it is, rather than necessarily the heavy political news. I think it would be different if there was a really significant political story that tugged at everybody's heartstrings. But while there are events going on which are serious, significant in places, Adrian earlier mentioned Syria, the trouble is it's old news and this is new news. If something broke now, I think the royal baby would be pushed off the centre of the front page. It'd still be on the front page, but as with the Telegraph, when Prince William was born, there would be some more stories as well.
All right, so short attention span theatre, unfortunately, playing a role sometimes in how we convey the news. I want to get back to a point that Andrew was making in part one of our discussion, or that you hinted at, which was we were talking about the issue of the relative merits of the different kinds of ways you can have a multi-party democracy in Western Europe. And you were saying how the royalty has outlived its usefulness. The website of Republic talks about, the low percentage you feel of elected officials that are actually elected. You have the House, I suppose that's an allusion to the House of Lords, most notably. Mm. Here in France, we have the Senate, which has a similar problem.
Mm-hmm. What's the question?
Well, the question is that is it really so different when you go from country to country in this respect? Don't you take it a bit far when you question whether or not the UK is a democracy?
No, I don't think so. I think we have a monarchical form of government. I mean, monarchy suffuses our whole political system. It's not just the unelected House of Lords. It's an honours system that's in serious need of reform. It's royal prerogative that took us into war in Iraq. It's many things. I mean, it's the right of the Prime Minister to appoint, unelected members to cabinet, for example. Without there being any sort of review of that process.
Florence,
It's quite hard to find an analogy for this antiquated system we have. It really is unfit for purpose in the 21st century. I mean, we don't really have a proper parliamentary democracy, quite frankly.
Not a proper parliamentary democracy. Florence, do you agree with that?
Well, the picture is actually quite complicated because the UK has, first, of course, is a democracy in the sense that there's an elected government. Now, there's a particular electoral system in the UK, which is winner takes all, or first past the post. It's just one round of election. And you can be elected and have a majority in Parliament with far fewer than 50%. So, for instance, you have an overwhelming, sometimes majority in the House of Commons with 43% of the votes. And if you round that with rising abstention to the number of people who actually support the government, you get closer to 35%. So that's where these arguments come from. Now, the UK is also a very old system that has evolved not by revolution, by a regular, slow process of amendment of an unwritten constitution. So, of course, there are a few remnants of these days, and it's very, very difficult to reform, as we have seen in the case of the House of Lords, which still has a small but a substantial, about 100 lords who are there by the simple fact that they have inherited their position. So there are a number of issues, of course, that people who oppose the monarchy, like the Republicans, will actually pick on.
Judith ROWBOTHAM, there is this sense seen from France, even though we know that Britain also has had revolutions, most notably in the 17th century, but there is this sense here that there's this sort of evolutionary process when it comes to Andrew Child's complaint that today there are not enough checks and balances with what's come up with, and it's ill-adapted to the 21st century. Do you feel as though the system of governance is antiquated?
I think that one of the problems that you face in any system of government is that it is antiquated. If you look at revolutions, what people do is they don't look forward when they're creating a post-revolutionary government. They look back. Sometimes they say, we do want that. Sometimes they say, we don't want that. But they're judging it by the past rather than by the future. I think that's very true in the wake of so many of the revolutions in the Arab Spring. So it's not just something that has happened in the distant past. But when you say, well, a proper parliamentary democracy, what do you mean by a proper parliamentary democracy? Who has ever exactly created a formal definition of that, which has been voted on and agreed by everybody? Could you actually get it? To some extent, we did have a referendum a while ago. Did people want to change the voting system? To the disappointment of many, the answer for those who cared enough to vote was no. And an awful lot of people didn't care enough one way or another to vote. So you're stuck with something where it's very easy to criticize the system, but if people actually won't get involved in politics, I've stood up and harangued my students because they can't be bothered to get up and go into the polling booth. And what do? Do you make voting compulsory? If we're going to get any kind of significant parliamentary reform, then I do think you have to start by passing measures to make participation by the adult population compulsory.
Ooh.
So I would start there rather than with reforming the monarchy.
Christophe, that's typical that's topical rather in Belgium.
Yeah, voting is compulsory in Belgium, one of the few countries in the world, along with Australia, I believe. But the issue of checks and balances is very interesting, because I think if you talk to French people, a lot of them actually envy monarchies like Sweden, Denmark, and I think to a large extent Britain, where you have a very strong sense of scrutiny on the political class. This is not the case in France. We all know it. You can literally get away with murder in France when you're a politician. Look at previous presidents. I'm not talking about murder, of course, but suspicion of embezzlement. I think that the French, I mean, let's be honest, really envy a lot of
expenses scandals. Come on, that's nonsense.
Well, I don't want to dwell on to the British story, but I still believe that a lot of French are convinced that the British system is there is more scrutiny. But look at Denmark, Sweden; these are very good examples.
Andrew, the grass is always greener elsewhere. The perception here is that there are more checks and balances in the UK, and with the MP expenses scandal, that it was the press that kept these lawmakers honest.
We shouldn't have to rely on the press to do that.
Why not?
We should have a
Surely
system
that is
because
one
they're
of
not
the roles
properly
of the press.
regulated. I mean, they do
Why
what they
developed?
like.
All right. Well, certainly there is this.
I feel like we've got a bit off topic here too.
No, we are getting a little bit off topic.
We have.
I just want to point out a comment on Twitter from Alyssa, who says that she loves the fact that even the French are admitting to monarchy envy. And we were mentioning in part one of our discussion how royalty can certainly be about preserving national cohesion, especially, as Christophe was saying, in Belgium, where the French-speaking Walloons and the Dutch-speaking Flemish have come close to breaking point. So personal touches can also help to lighten the mood.
As regards to Queen Paola, who has always been supporting me in my task during the last 20 years, I would like to say to her, thank you and a big kiss.
Yeah, un gros kiss, that played well, the saying un gros kiss.
It was the headline. I mean, even in English it sounds almost acceptable. In French it was certainly acceptable, but it's also a sign that you can be a monarch and you can have humor and come across as the guy next door. That was really the case with Albert.
Okay, but I want to pick up then on the point that Florence made at the beginning. When we were talking, I was asking her about a bill, that the reform, and she said, well, the Queen has her, is consulted on these things. How much in Europe, when it's be it in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Belgium, or Britain, how much say does a monarch have?
It depends on the countries. For instance, in the Netherlands, you recently had a reform where the monarch no longer helps in forming a government. This is nothing short of a revolution. It means that in the Netherlands, the monarch no longer plays a political role. In Belgium, officially, of course, it's not the king who's going to appoint the prime minister. It's not the king who's going to choose who will sit in parliament. But the king has a role during these very difficult negotiations. I told you last time it took us more than 500 days to form a government. And of course, the king played a very big role in that, in the sense that he really acts as a mediator, someone who, after 500 days, knocks on the table and says, look, guys, we just look ridiculous. This is the longest political crisis. We've even beaten Iraq. Let's get together, form a government. In countries like...
Do you think in this case, like in Italy, we've seen the president, Giorgio Napolitano, take on this sort of role as the old wise man who steps
absolutely.
in? Do you think that the fact that he's a monarch matters, or it doesn't really matter? It could have been a president, the same thing.
Well, I think in the case, I think in Belgium it does matter, but then again, it's a small country.
And as
it's
you were
also
saying,
very
it's a bit
different.
artificial, right? Because you've had this monarch only since 1848. It's not.
1831. 1831. Of course, you can argue that Belgium is an artificial country. You can argue that this country is not a country, not a nation. I personally believe it is a nation, and I personally believe that those who believe it is a nation recognize themselves in the monarch because he's the king of all the Belgians, being Flemish from Brussels or from the south.
And it wouldn't be the same with a president.
I don't think that Belgium would survive with a president. I think if we were to transform the system into a presidential system, you would have Flanders independent and then potentially Wallonia and Brussels together. I don't think the country has a future with a president. And I don't think that the majority of Belgians would like that. If anything, when you look at the polls, traditionally in the south and in Brussels, there's a strong majority in favor of monarchy. But even in the north, you have a lot of people saying we would like the king to have less of a role, particularly politically, but a majority of Flemish people still want to keep a king.
So, Florence, I'm a little confused here. As somebody who is unelected gets more traction with the voters than somebody who would be?
Because it's a symbolic role, because he's, as you were saying, above the political class, and that gives the king a standing that none of the politicians, especially when extremely divided, and when the electoral system doesn't allow the emergence of a very clear majority, when you need to have negotiations between a plurality of parties from both sides. Of course, the king is above all this, and therefore gets the traction that allows him, in this case, to put his fist on the table. In a sense, the British monarch has similar powers. They haven't been used for quite a while because the electoral system in the UK means that usually there is an automatic majority in Parliament. Last time we didn't have that. However, the parties managed to form a coalition fairly swiftly. Now, the monarch has had the power in the past when the party who had won the election had no clear leader, and there would have been a residual power for the monarch to actually choose who would be the prime minister. So there are some very limited powers, but the fact that this person is not elected really removes some of the tensions of having to play popularity contests. Some of the difficulties of Hollande at the moment is basically that he's an elected president who in a few years' time will have to run again probably, and this is a concern that makes, that has an influence on how they behave in politics, how they have to run behind the news or try to precede the news. I think this creates quite a different situation.
In monarchies also, you have a prime minister who is a rather technocratic figure, and people don't expect this prime minister to act like a king or to act like a ruler. And that makes his life much easier. When you look in France, you mentioned Hollande, I think part of his problems are that a number of French don't regard him as a ruler. And that may hint that they still expect from their president to be a sort of monarch who embodies this institution and still, rules from the Élysée like some other kings used to rule from Versailles.
We've had an interesting succession of presidents in France. We had the people president, the Sarkozy, the bling-bling presidency, and now we have the normal presidents. But actually it's failing to find the right balance in terms of symbolic power, in terms of the aura that the French people expect from the person who is their head of state.
Yeah, one two hands on and the other not presidential enough. Andrew Child, if you take the case of the UK, Elizabeth officially queen of more than just Great Britain and Northern Ireland. 15 nations, including Canada and Australia, make up what's known the Commonwealth realm. The Australians, they put it to a vote and said, would you like to be a Republican, no longer have a queen? And they voted no. When you hear the argument about what happens when you elect a president, do you understand a little better?
I think you're rather missing the point there. I mean, most Australians actually wanted a republic. They couldn't agree on a model, unfortunately. And, I think it was the quality of the debate that they had. And I think we have a similarly poor quality of debate over here. It's interesting you're talking about the powers of the monarch. I mean, they're quite substantial in the UK. The Queen has a weekly briefing from the Prime Minister. We don't know what's said. She has regular briefings from her Council of Privy Ministers. Again, we don't know what's said. She has a veto, along with Charles, over any legislation that affects their land holdings. Again, we don't know what's said because the royal family, although it's a public institution, isn't subject to our freedom of information laws, which is really quite extraordinary. You could say that's a power in itself, couldn't you?
And final point on this, Judith ROWBOTHAM, the fact is this is a monarch who has been a queen since Winston Churchill was prime minister. Just by virtue of how long she's been there, she is a powerful woman.
Powers associated with enduring symbols, yes, but she is generally careful to make sure that her prime ministers, something that they themselves acknowledge, make the decisions. She can advise, or usually it seems warn, and so from that point of view, I think she is very conscious of a need not to abuse her powers, and I think that is one of the reasons why she has remained popular overall during her reign.
So it is a balancing act, come what may. I want to thank all of you, Judith ROWBOTHAM for joining us from London, also Andrew Child, and here in the studio, Florence FAUCHER and Christophe ROBEET. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us here for the France 24 debate. We'll continue to doorstep that clinic come what may.